Thank you, Grace, and thank you to all of our presenters. So SOSA is now going to bring our speakers to the front of your screen, creating a virtual-like panel. So I will be reading the questions asked in the Q&A and some that have been messaged to me personally. If you would like to ask a question live, feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you. SOSA will then bring you into the panel and you can ask your question in person. So I think it's probably smart to start with our first Q&A question. And as a fellow medievalist, I was also wondering this. So this question is from Matt Hunter, and it's a question for Hannah Kressel. So I work on ancient and medieval recipes, and I'm interested in many of the same aspects you discuss about the construction of culture and identity through food. I'm interested to hear if you have thoughts on whether your theory might work in pre-modern contexts, where the genre of cookbook is not necessarily meant for a broad public consumption or engagement.
Thank you for your question. So I don't have extensive, or I haven't done extensive research into pre-modern context with cookbooks, but I think the real core of what I'm thinking about is how is identity kind of built into the way the recipes are written. And I think that in some ways, it's even more prevalent in pre-modern work because you're so kind of local to where you are. So there's like question of access to food in terms of your physical location, and then also wealth. Is in some ways plays even more of a role than in today, where you can, if you're in the U.S., you can go to really any grocery store and have access to a decent number of things from all over the place. And I think that what really excites me about cookbooks is how they're so kind of reflective of the person's identity and like where they live, like what's their kind of domestic status, what's their wealth status, where are they situated in society, in a city, outside of a city, and all those things come up in cookbooks. And I think even if they're not being shared with a broad public, that relationship between someone, a user of a recipe and the recipe developer, that still can exist. So even though recipes aren't published or shared very broadly, there's still this relationship there, and kind of a question of agency and control, like someone who wrote the recipe versus someone following the recipe. So those were some of the thoughts I had when I read the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. So we have a lot of questions streaming in, and so hopefully we can get to them all. So the next question is for Adrian. So what was the eventual outcome of the Gucci situation?
So I actually met Sharona Franklin when I was doing my master's at the University of British Columbia, and someone asked the same thing. It's sort of up in the air because Sharona Franklin didn't want a lawsuit because Gucci is such a powerful, identity, but also a legal power around copyright, which is ultimately, that Sharona Franklin got her social recognition, at least. People were spamming Gucci and kind of they were made a fool of. But in terms of the actual, we were wondering the same thing, and my initial reaction of it was like, not in terms of monetary recognition, because it was only posted through Instagram. So it wasn't necessarily something that was commodified and sold. It was something that was published through their general account. So, I mean, what she did say was, she said she was very thankful for the support she got. But unfortunately, I don't think Gucci was like, oh, we're so sorry about this. It was kind of like the classic cases of artists, big companies stealing. And I mean, we can think of like, how many Basquiat and Keith Haring runways are there lately? Like, I feel like there's so many commodified fashion artworks of marginalized bodies and peoples for mass consumption, which is a whole nother thing about talking about food and patents and how it relates to medicine, but I'll end it there. So I don't really have an answer to your question.
But you've given us a lot to think about and hopefully in the future to write about. So our next question is to Grace. So this anonymous attendee asks, I'm wondering if you know how Haynes Superstar was received by the public in Karen Carpenter's estate. Interesting.
That's a fantastic question, and also gives me a chance to explain why the quality of the photos or the stills from that movie in my PowerPoint are so bad. So that film actually was banned from circulation, and it's because, officially, it's because Haynes didn't get the copyright permissions from the Carpenter's estate because he knew that he never would be able to. But, you know, it is very much the belief that it's because Haynes really portrays Richard Carpenter and their mother as being incredibly controlling. And this was really in line also with when I was talking about these kind of voiceover, really didactic narratives that center anorexia. One of the really big narratives about anorexia is that it's about a reclaiming of control. So in that, he really ends up kind of blaming Karen's family for her eating disorder. And that obviously was not great for the Carpenter's image, which is this like super bubblegum, like all American, like, you know, they performed at the White House for President Nixon. He loved them. I don't hold it against them. But as far as the public is concerned, it's become this kind of cult classic. And you can still see it. If you're interested, you can watch it online. It's on YouTube and on Dailymotion. But it's this incredibly grainy quality that Lucas Hillebrand has referred to as bootleg aesthetics. And it's because it's only available on these VHSs that have been taped over and taped over and taped over and taped over. And then kind of distributed. And someone took one of those, ripped it and put it online. But in the past, you would kind of get people together. Bootleg aesthetics is where it's at. In the past, you would kind of get people together, all watch it together. And it was this really kind of contraband experience. So the public has, and scholars have really loved it. But the Carpenters, Richard and his family, not so much.
Thank you, Grace. So I'm going to move on to the questions directly sent to me. So you won't be able to see them in the Q&A box. So the next question is for Leah. So you gave a really great analysis of this image, but I am working, they're wondering, what does it mean to have this image on a biscuit? What does it mean to kind of ingest an image? To have its only permanent form on a mold? While the food stuff itself disappears into the human body?
That's a really fascinating question, and it would be probably interesting to link that with yesterday's talk about the breasts of the saint and the sort of medieval context of ingesting food and what it meant. But I think it can also be linked to the visual, because just as much as food enters our body directly and the image would enter our body or would enter someone's body, you have a similar belief about images and the process of viewing something as consuming through your eyes. So images were thought to have powers, healing powers, protective powers, and just by looking at them, it would do something to your body, which is why pregnant women were not supposed to see horrific scenes and things like this, because it was thought that it would affect the baby in the womb. So I do think that there's actually quite a tangible link between consuming an image through looking at it or through eating it. And I don't think I thought about this as this closely connected until you anonymously asked this question. So thank you for that. And I think that's actually an interesting follow-up to think about this potential link, because I do think I've thought about it more in a context of the kinds of conversations that were to be had about this object before it was ingested. And obviously, yeah, it's a shame that we'll never be able to see the actual object that was created there.
Thank you. So we have another question, and this one is for Adrian again. So why the choice of gelatin as a sculptural medium? The opportunity to suspend objects within gelatin's matrix is clearly evident, but do you see additional significance to this choice, perhaps related to gelatin's proximity to animal bone as an organic material?
Yes, so Shona Franklin is very direct about using gelatin because not only does gelatin have animal cells in it, in its composition, but also because it follows, it gets moldy, right? It gets moldy, it starts to disintegrate over time. And Shona Franklin often talks about, especially when looking at medicine and daily rituals towards medicine, about time is a huge aspect, right? And with gelatin, unfortunately, right now, well, first of all, the sculpture melts, and it has to be thrown out. So this, this liminality that this sculpture lives in, it's like, it is this timepiece that you need to see it in a moment. But also with time, especially when looking at disability, is with Shona Franklin. I met her about a year and a half ago, like I mentioned, at the University of British Columbia, and I wanted to reach out to her and to speak to her through her Instagram to invite, I was hoping she would come to this talk, but unfortunately right now, about half a year ago, maybe more, she was and still experiencing a tremendous health scare, and she deleted all of her social media accounts. And I mean, they had like massive amounts of followers. And this is the thing when talking about disability, oftentimes in the artistic labor community, we expect people with different abilities to uphold the same standard of rigorous labor exploitation, right? And ultimately, these nuances of experiences of the human body are ignored for the valorization of art, right? How many people like Gucci have stolen her artwork, and meanwhile don't pay her? And that, I'm thinking of this with gelatin too. There was a slippage between, body's emotion and experiences of bodies, but, this sculpture no longer exists, but we find, many photographs of it. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering with gelatin, is the slippage between an object and a body.
Thank you, Adrian. And I'm receiving so many questions from all different avenues. So the audience is very engaged with all of your presentations. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee, and this is for Willow. So I wonder what thoughts you have on survivance and its relationship to the recent retirement of Desjardins' logo for Land O Lakes Butter.
That is a really good question. I'm seeing that other one that came in right after it is kind of related to this discussion of the Land O'Lakes logo as it relates to Desjardins. So I can maybe answer those in tandem to some extent. But the logo for Land O'Lakes is very much kind of like the elephant in the room when you're talking about Desjardins, because it is the thing he's most well known for. But I wouldn't say I considered it in context of survivance or anything like that, but it does have to be addressed as an important part of his career. Specifically, he did a redesign of it. He's not the actual original artist. The original logo is much more painterly and very grounded in sort of like Northwoods tourist aesthetics that you'd normally expect for a Minnesota-based company in some ways. But he was in charge of redesigning it at one point, I think the third redesign, and he did go out of his way to include cultural signifiers that mark her as an Ojibwa woman in what he has said about it. I'm not sure how many of those have been preserved throughout the decades until we got to the point where it was removed. But kind of connecting that to the second question, though, it is kind of an issue when writing on him that the most of the images that come up when you look up his art are just that Land O'Lakes logo, and it really has dominated now the memory of him because of this recent controversy that doesn't have so much to do with his family controlling his legacy, although some of his children did rightfully, they had the opinion of being upset that the logo was retired because they viewed it as a really important thing their dad did that had tribal specificity. But it does dominate everything. And in general, that has more to do with the fact that while that sort of commercial work that he did in his career as a commercial artist has had a much longer lifespan and currency in the popular imaginary versus in general, he's from a generation of Indigenous artists who are just extremely underwritten and not really talked about a lot when we're talking about these artists who were working basically from, I would say, maybe the 1920s up until the 1980s. Not a lot of people discuss these artists. So he's usually published about through Minnesota-based publications more than anything. He's very much one of those artists who's been preserved locally, more so in the broader sense. So part of why I undertook writing on him was to sort of address that lack, and to kind of have companion pieces that will maybe factor in alongside his work on the Butter Maiden, as she is known.
Thank you, Willow. And I also quite enjoy your cat. So I think the next question is a good one to end at, since we're going to be ending at 1:05. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of your questions that have been messaged to me. But I think this is a good one because it's asking kind of the group as a whole. So this question from an anonymous attendee asks, how do each of our speakers see their work in relation to the discipline of art history? Do we think that by adding food to art as a subject or idea, we kind of begin to destabilize the hierarchy of senses? Or does the depiction of food as something still visual and not tasted through our static medium keep the works you discussed in the realm of the visual? So does anybody want to attempt to answer that first?
I can hop in since I haven't had to be put on the spot yet. So I think the connecting it immediately to the destabilizing the hierarchy of the senses is a great direction, and definitely something I've been thinking about. And for me, the looking more into the early modern Spanish conception of looking at painting, like you're confronted with the fact that it wasn't this simply visual disembodied experience. Like it was very much a more invasive and troubling experience that is more comparable to things that we ingest or smell or touch. So thinking of vision not in the way that maybe we do now, but as a fuller sense of perception.
Thank you, Sarah.
I can speak, I guess, a little bit to that question. So I have a background in studio art, and I think I first kind of started making these connections between food and art just in my own practice of painting and then going home and cooking. And I cook a lot, I bake a lot of bread. And I think the physical process of making work and making food is so similar. And I think that a big reason why food hasn't been considered by art history is because, I mean, historically, like it's a domestic act. It's, traditionally done by women. And I think that, like, even though like there's so many similarities, like there's so much of eating is about the visual, in addition to obviously consuming and digesting. And I think that like it's really exciting right now to be looking at food and art, because we're kind of questioning like why hasn't this ever been talked about? Like there's such a rich history of food and art going back so many years. And I think, I don't know, I think that a lot of times because people just considered cooking as this domestic thing that we didn't see as behind closed doors, and we're missing this whole process. So.
Yeah, I think also a really important thing to think about when thinking about the kind of hierarchy of the senses is also the hierarchy of media, and that scholarship a lot of time unfortunately is governed by the market, and that has to do with what archives we have access to, what's been written about. I think it's amazing we had Carol kind of open today, because that is such an amazing example of art as food, food as art, the two being like the thaumatrope, completely one and the same at the same time. Because I do think that generally, you can't sell a meal for $1 million, as much as Salt Bay might be trying to, I think. Thinking about Carol saying that this hugely important part of history was tried to be sold to Castelli, he didn't want it. It was tried to be sold to restaurants, they didn't want it, and eventually she kind of got scammed, it seems like. Going back to what Adrian was talking about with the time-based part, it's really hard to sell a work made of gelatin because it is going to fail, and I think there is that kind of temporal element to art, or temporal element to food that I've been thinking about really heavily, just because of the kind of temporal speeding up that is kind of at the heart of the project that I'm working on. But it's no coincidence also that I'm looking at food that's being portrayed in moving image, in video, in experimental film. I think a lot of us also thinking about performance. And even if we're not looking at performance artists themselves, we're thinking about, I think Hannah, you talked really specifically about how these cookbooks perform. So yeah, I think that's a huge, I love that we're all working on food because of that.
Oh, you can go ahead, Willow.
Okay, just really quickly, I would say I'm obviously talking about an artist whose practice is a lot more illustrative in some ways, as far as, showing these processes of how these foods are obtained and stuff like that. And I do think there's also an element of food and art and its relationship to memory, because taste is so deeply connected to our memories, and we have like really instant memories that come up in relation to tastes. And I think it's no coincidence that Desjardins has like a lot of memories that he talks about in that interview that are all tied to him being a kid and having like sugar maple cakes and stuff like that when he's present at these sugar camps in the early spring. And I think in some ways his art practice and the images he produces also can connect us to our memories of food. I know for me, part of the appeal that first made me want to write on him was that as someone who grew up in the Great Lakes region, I am used to that sort of seasonal repetition of like, when are people actually tapping trees to get maple sap out of them? And I think that's another element of food and art that's really powerful. I also would think in some ways that some of the work that Michael Rakowitz has done also has to deal with food's connection to culture and memory in ways that, he's more directly engaging in it with Enemy Kitchen and actually serving food, but the visual representation of food, I think, can kind of tap into those things too.
I'll jump in here, and I in response to both, what Willow and Grace and everyone's talking about, I think for me, as a begrudged art historian, as someone who doesn't necessarily see themselves as an art historian, but the discipline says I am, I think, how I view the history of art alongside the history of food is that it is the history of commodified and decommodified labor. It is the history of making and unmaking things. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about why this is excluded, why food is excluded in art history. And maybe it's because, food doesn't want to be seen as a commodity. Oftentimes food is time-based, but ultimately, if you look at the commodification of artwork and copyright law, with food now, we're always talking about the ethical sources of food and the patents of food. Look at the United States and Africa and Monsanto literally colonizing through the use of seed and spreading this seed across the world, and not letting farmers actually grow what they want. And like the aesthetic form of the artwork, ultimately we are constantly at battle with the form of the thing. So that is where I view as the food in art history laying in this spectrum.
Possibly as a more of a response to Grace earlier, I just I think what amazes me with the focus on such an early modern item like that biscuit mold is that the sources and the context in which this was created clearly tells us that this was a highly valued thing. The mold itself, because it is recorded in inventories over and over again, so it was worth something. And especially the ones made out of stone were valued very highly. And the object that they created, the actual biscuit, must have also, I mean, the amazement that Bock writes in his work that these precious objects were marzipan biscuits that were brought out to be then consumed, I think places it in quite a sort of high hierarchy in the end, much higher than we would ever think about it today. And I think this is reflected in the barriers of the disciplines in a way, because you would never find today, if this painting had survived, you would find the painting on the wall of a gallery, and where would you find the biscuit mold? Like this, the fact that we assume that, and it's probably correct, but the fact that we assume that these objects have to be linked through a work on paper, through a print, shows us, I think, the importance that we place on certain media over other. And I do think that looking at food from this kind of angle allows us to actually break down those barriers that we constructed, because clearly 15th century people felt very differently about this, and just, you know, look at it from a different point of view.
Thank you all for your very thoughtful answers in this extremely illuminating panel. I'm going to send it over to Sosa, who's going to make some closing remarks. I was sent far too many questions to ask in our short time period. So if you asked a question and I didn't articulate it, feel free to go to our website and we have an email and we can put you in contact with the presenter.